So first I am going to introduce the filmmakers, and then do my best to thank them for joining us. And then I think I will hopefully we'll go through a conversation about filmmaking in Vermont, and maybe discuss some of the ideas of what that might mean. And then through that, we'll talk about each of the films, their 5 films, and about their work. And I hope we can make it as much of a conversation as possible. So if any of the filmmakers and any other participants have a question or thought, put it in the chat and I'll read it. Or if it's sort of immediate, just raise your hand, either a Zoom one or real one. And yeah, and we can, and then after a quick discussion about filmmaking in Vermont, whatever that means, we can move into a genuine back and forth, hopefully, and just talk. So, all right, so I'm gonna just do some quick introductions so we're all kind of on the same page. And a lot of us are meeting for the first time anyways, so we'll have to get some better introductions than the generic ones. But so Natasha Ngaiza, a mother, hi, there she is an assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media Culture at Middlebury College. Her short narrative films have screened at various international festivals and art venues and all center Black mothers as their protagonists. Her film, A Mother, is in the narrative short section in the festival. Mina Fitzpatrick is a director, editor, and cinematographer based in Los Angeles. She is a graduate of Northwestern's MFA Documentary Media Program and a former Fulbright Scholar in South Korea. Her work has been recognized by the American Society of Cinematographers and screened in festivals in the US and internationally. She currently teaches cinematography and documentary production at the California Institute of the Arts in Santa Clarita, California. And her film is Vondervogel. And I actually just realized this morning that she's also credited on Palenque, another WRIF short. So both films. Next is Rich Fedorchak. He is a self-taught artist who has been making experimental films in the Super 8 film medium since the 1970s. His films have been screened at various juried festivals devoted to small gauge film in the US and Canada. He has been a guest lecturer and presenter in the film and media department at Dartmouth College. Next is Quinn Tomashow. She's a filmmaker, musician, and educator with a deep passion for community. She recently graduated from Hampshire College, where she studied experimental filmmaking. Quinn primarily works in 16mm and Super 8 film and has a passion for hand processing, as well as experimenting with natural developing techniques. And Susan Bettman. Oh, sorry, and Rich's film is Brief Glimpses on the Way to Joy, which is in the documentary section. Quinn's is Nature's Optical Toy. And Susan Bettman of Joe Picard, Man of the Land, has been a documentary filmmaker since 2002, mainly focused on short films about Vermont, Vermonters, the arts, and nature. So those are our 5 guests who I'm very honored to all have together right now. So yeah, we want to have a conversation about what it means to be a Vermont filmmaker or to make films in Vermont. And I know that, or to be a filmmaker from Vermont, or any of those. So I have some ideas about what that means, and I'm hoping that if we can kind of go through those, we will arrive at some other ideas. So for me, one of the immediately obvious joys of filmmaking in Vermont is a predisposition, I would say, toward community. It's possibly because of the concentration that working in Vermont, the specificity and concentration at working as filmmakers in Vermont. But it does seem inevitable that confluences and sort of such as this occur And I can imagine that this sort of community follows outside of Vermont. I think to meet someone from Vermont is fortunate, but to meet another filmmaker from Vermont is something else entirely. So this first question is about community, which impacts filmmaking in different ways. When a film is scripted and acted and produced meticulously, it often creates a village to make it. On the other hand, someone like Rich Fedorchak, his films often come out of just living, so community is more frequently folded into the making. So filmmaking sometimes comes from in the production, sometimes in showing. It also sometimes is in the film. I would say that Mina's film Vondervogel and Susan's Joe Picard film are about community, or sometimes a lack of. So I'm wondering if we can go through the 5 filmmakers and just talk about community, what that means, if it means anything to your films, and whether that forms in making, watching, or within the film itself. Does anyone want to take a crack at that to start, or should I help by calling on?
I can start us off. I want to say thank you also for having me. And so is my microphone okay? It's not doing weird things. Okay. And to meet this group of Vermont filmmakers is exciting. I was born in Vermont. I haven't lived there full time since I was a child, but I go back every summer, and it's kind of cool to think about a Vermont community of filmmakers that I could potentially tap into. And yeah, so I think with regard to community and my film Wandervogel, which is about sort of a reclusive type character in the desert in Texas, and really I think, as you said, Everest, a lack of community perhaps for certain people who choose to isolate themselves, and yet in these places that are so isolated and so removed from society, each relationship you have is really, really important and really strong, I think. And so that's something that I hear time and time again in the desert community, is that even though people are going there to sort of get away from typical society and from the relationships maybe they had before, there's a sort of new forging of community that's really important to them and really life sustaining. It becomes like the only way to survive is to create these relationships out there. So I think it is an important part of the film, even if it's sort of just suggested at throughout.
And just to kind of go off that a little bit, filmmaking can be a community making type of project where you have to be kind of living in close proximity. Or I'm just curious a little bit about in terms of the community and the logistics of making that film. I mean, how close did you become in a kind of community or isolated while shooting the film?
Yeah, I would love, yeah, I'm curious to hear other people's sort of experiences of that. But for myself, I usually work alone or with with maybe 1 or 2 people on set, a camera person or sound person. And in this case, it was really important I had somebody with me, because basically the premise of the film is that I'm making a documentary about a subject or a person, and I show up to film them at their house in the middle of the desert, and I find their body. So they had just died, and the filmmakers, we're the ones that find them. And so had I been alone, that would have been a completely different experience and quite terrifying, and really traumatic. I think it was much better because I had brought somebody with me and I was able to sort of lean on them in that moment. So since then, I rarely return without somebody with me. And that's just something that's kind of been ingrained in me now. Whereas before I was really kind of adamant about, I could do it by myself. I don't need help. And there's something really therapeutic about just going and filming by yourself. So yeah, I think in documentary film work, it's really nice when you find yourself in unexpected situations to have buddies, to have people with you.
Yeah, does anyone have a thought about that? I have a couple sort of questions for others based on that. For instance, Rich, his mode of working, I mean, is very, especially in the film that's in the festival, Brief Glimpses on the Way to Joy, is very, in a way, individual because he's documenting a first person perspective over the course of years. But at the same time, it's also documenting his community in his genuine life. So maybe, Rich, you could talk about difference between working alone but also being together.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, my whole becoming a filmmaker uh, it was born out of community because I didn't study art filmmaking in college. I came out with a degree in biology and English, and eventually went back to school, became a registered nurse. But uh, about a year and a half after I got out of college, I was living in Boston. I moved back to New Jersey, which is where I'm from originally, or where I went to college. And I was just, you know, sort of roaming the streets for looking for a familiar face. And I ran into somebody who I knew from school. I was looking to, find an apartment and hopefully a roommate or something. And this person said, well, geez, I just moved into this big house, two-story house with a bunch of other people, all of whom went to Montclair State University, where I went. Why don't you come and check it out? So I went there and checked it out, ended up moving in. Everybody there had gone to that college as art majors. So it was a very creative community that I moved into. And there was art making going on almost every day. And that was very exciting to me to watch that. And I wanted in, but I didn't feel like, oh, I have the education to be an artist. But I started reading actually Jonas Meekis's movie journals in the Village Voice in the 70s and became introduced to experimental film through those. And I when P. Adam Sidney's magnum opus about American avant-garde film came out, which I think was in 1974, I bought a copy of that and I carried it around like a Bible. So I became like really, really immersed in this. At the same time, I became immersed in starting to work in collage and assemblage. So it all kind of converged together at that point. But I had no formal training, but now I've had many years of autodidactic training. But so that's how it started. But I really came into it, as much as I would enjoy a Hollywood film or something, I never thought I would make a film like that. But I just started by buying a used Super 8 camera and working on projects around the house and incorporating some of the people that live there. There was a lot of diary filmmaking, but over time, I actually made a few films that actually had something of a storyline, but only two, maybe three that would could be vaguely considered a narrative. So, but that community that I started with, that carried on for almost all of my life. Some of those same people I'm still very close to, and one of those people had. And talking about being from Vermont, I moved here 31 years ago, and that actually marked a period for me of getting back into filmmaking, because in the 80s, I wasn't doing much filmmaking. I was doing other stuff, working and doing other artwork, but not film. But when I moved to Vermont, um, the beauty of the natural landscape really captured my attention, and that got me back into filmmaking, and I never really stopped after that. But one of the main places that besides Vermont, where I film is out in the outer Cape at Cape Cod, because one of my friends that I knew from college days had moved out there, and I spent a lot of time filming out on the Cape that became incorporated into films. So yeah, community, for me, it's all about, and just one other thing I'll say, it was a hard time. I had a hard time finding community when I moved to Vermont first, because I didn't know anybody, obviously. And I didn't know what kind of film scene there was here. But fairly early on, I met Bruce Posner, who I know you know, who puts on this Cine Salon thing every 2 weeks on a seasonal basis. And he shows lots of films that you would not see in any other way. And then another landmark was when Jody Mack came to teach at Dartmouth, because Jody's an experimental filmmaker and animator. And Jody and I became really good friends. And now I know Everest and Quinn, and now we're talking about doing micro cinemas and various venues around here. So it's kind of come full circle again for me, because that was stuff I was doing way back in the 70s. And now it feels like very fresh again. But the Vermont landscape has played an important part in,
Yeah.
my current films.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I want to, that's like sort of my next benchmark. I want to continue going with some themes about community. Susan, from some of what I've understand, I think I've learned a little bit about your connections to the Bread and Puppet Theater. And that's a whole realm of community and arts in Vermont that I find to be really fascinating for for numerous reasons. But one is how specifically rural it feels to me, and yet the Bread and Puppet Theater sort of transplanted itself to Vermont, to a rural setting, but it's somehow sort of ingrained itself into the landscape. And so I guess I'm just curious, in that's a very sort of specific and almost, really beautiful vision of arts community. So I'm curious how that maybe has informed your filmmaking, if not your life.
My life, I would say. Yeah, I came to Vermont in 1970 with Bread and Puppet. I'd been working with them in New York City. I was interested in street theater and political theater. And the kind of work they were doing in New York changed once they came up here. And it did become very land-based, and they had a lot they have a lot of engagement with the land and how things grow, gardening, raising, growing rye to make rye bread to hand out to audiences. And I was with them for several years, and I continue to work with them from time to time. My family was raised going to, being involved in Bread and Puppet shows every summer. And when I left, I worked with my now ex-husband to do a kind of spin-off theater called Dragon Dance Theater. And one of the things that drove me into video and filmmaking was that we used to do pageants, and they were one-of-a-kind events. And we'd work all month building puppets and masks and costumes and sets, and training people to perform something. We'd perform it once or twice and it'd be gone. That'd be it. And I felt it was important to document all of that work. And that's how I met Nora. She came to Mexico to work with us in one of the performances we were doing there. And from that, I got to be involved with her feature film, Nothing Like Dreaming. And after that, I was excited enough about learning filmmaking that I worked on a documentary film of my own, and several, which was about a concert pianist who used to live in Montpelier. Was beyond 88 keys, meaning beyond the piano keyboard, that kind of musicianship, that it was bigger than the instrument, about this pianist, Michael Arnowit. And I've done several films about Vermont, Vermonters, did something about Peter Schumann, who's the director of Bread and Puppet, baking rye bread, what goes into it, what, getting up at 5 in the morning and kneading dough for an hour and a half and baking it in an outdoor oven when it's minus 10 degrees. And I did a film about Vermont poet David Budbill. It was a tribute on his birthday shortly before he died, put on by fellow poets and actors reading from his work. So that's where I came from. And to do Man of the Land, I was having my land logged for firewood, and Joe Picard was the logger, and he was very proud of the work that he does. The footage was filmed in 2007, mostly, a little bit in 2008. So it's old, and the technology was old. It was even old at the time. So it was all standard definition. But he wanted it to be shown that he knew how to do these things.
Mm.
And these were things that people just don't do very much, in a rural setting like ours. People still cut their own firewood. Very few people do haying. Very few people do brush hogging. A number of people do snow plowing because you need to, but the combination of that with his background, which was French Canadian and Abenaki, created a kind of language that I thought of as vanishing music. It just was, nobody was going to talk his kind of language anymore. His kids don't. They've all been to school. He went to 8th grade, and that was about it.
Yeah.
And then he was working in the woods for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and how's he? What's he doing now? Is he the same?
Yeah, he still does some snow plowing. He's pretty much retired, because at the time of the movie he was 62, so now he's 75.
Right.
And it takes a toll on the body to do that kind of work.
He's your neighbor, essentially.
Yeah, he is.
It's great. So that's a whole other, community filmmaking type of action. So just to get around the circle again, Natasha, in terms of this group, your film is the narrative film, and so I'm interested, maybe thinking about some of the things that have come up so far, and about maybe your perspective on life in Vermont and meeting people in Vermont and so on. In terms of the work and the process of crafting something like your film, A Mother, which is very specific in its tone and its so I'd be interested to hear your perspective on community, and then specifically, I guess, the Vermont community of creating that, which from what I understand was created in Vermont.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think my perspective is a little different in that, well, one, I haven't been living in Vermont for that long. Well, I guess this is the 6th year that I've been in Vermont, and I'm raising my children here. I have 3 daughters, and feel very much a part of, like, a Vermonter now, which is very strange to say, but yeah, I'm here. And the kind of interesting thing is that my work does revolve around stories of the African diaspora, stories about Black communities, Black life. And so Vermont is not exactly in that demographic too much, right? So, but, you know, as some people have pointed out, it's also such a cinematic state, right? It's such a beautiful place. And so there are these, so, and I'm here, I am here,
Right.
I live here. And I do believe in writing from what I know and my own experiences. And of course there are Black people in Vermont, right? And that doesn't really get talked about too much, or people don't usually think about those communities. So when it came to writing and then producing A Mother, it was a learning experience because it was the first time that I was shooting in Vermont. I ended up bringing in several people from outside. The director of photography was from LA. Several other camera people were coming from LA. The art director was from New York. People are coming from Philly, which is where I previously made films. But then there was this really lovely community of Vermont filmmakers who really, it was the producer, Ethan Murphy, first assistant director, Daniel Houghton, and several students and alum from Middlebury also who came in, and just, not to mention other Vermont filmmakers that came together to really make the film happen. And it was a really wonderful experience. I mean, it was interesting because the people from LA were like, this is not like anything that we've dealt with, right? It's like we had to drive to Boston to get the things that they wanted, or to New York, or have people fly in from LA with camera, gear and accessories. But everybody came away from the experience feeling, what's the word? Like, there's something very refreshing about Vermont, like the kind of slower pace, the closeness to nature, and I feel like that was kind of integrated in the way that we produced A Mother, or at least I, from my perspective, which is going to be different than other people's perspective, of course, but yeah. So I think, I mean, to answer your question, yes, working on a narrative fictional film is so highly collaborative. Like, there's no way I could have done this film without the many number of people that were working on it. But it was also like, yeah, where is my place as a Black filmmaker who is interested in making films about Black people? The actors also, I should mention this, the actors were coming from New York, from Boston, the main actors. The kids happened to be from Vermont, happened to live in Vermont, the kids who are in A Mother. But that was also a big kind of concern and challenge. It was like, well, who are we, like, what actors are we like getting, right? But here I am.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, that's so something else that I sort of, this is just another topic that I've been thinking about in terms of filmmaking in Vermont is something that a few others have brought up, which is the landscape, or the land, or the place that Vermont is, and also maybe even the idea of just an appreciation of the landscape that somewhere like or of a landscape that something like living in Vermont can give you. And even I think there's a few other films that are like very much aimed at nature and the landscape. But I think even A Mother is, I mean, it's very much like rooted in its place, which is interesting to hear that. I mean, it was a collaborative process with people from elsewhere, but also it was made in Vermont. Like you said, you are in Vermont. You know, that absolutely had to have shaped, I would imagine, its creation, and of course shapes what's on camera. And I'm interested in how, I mean, nature plays an interesting role in the film, like towards the second half of the film. And also, I think so. There's something. What I'm getting at is that there's a landscape, both of the place, and then, of course, I think also with your film and with other films, of time too. So I'm interested if you could talk about both the place and the time of making this film and making it in Vermont. Some of what you've already talked about, but
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was something that the landscape to me was like another character, and that was present in kind of earlier drafts of the screenplay.
mm,
It was the idea was actually started with the idea of a child being lost in this kind of in the woods, and really seeing various kind of hills and kind of open fields. I mean, the landscape was always like a very important part of the kind of foundation, I guess, of the script. So yes, I think I can just say that I did see it as its own character, and the director of photography and myself, Arlene Muller, amazing DP. She, we thought a lot about how we were going to be shooting the outside. We looked at many different places, spaces, exterior locations.
yeah.
And we're kind of inspired by that, and the connection between the landscape and this woman's kind of psychological journey, right, through this really difficult decision, was really important to like kind of make that connection. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting, you asked.
Well, about the time also, but I actually want to pause there because I think what's something really interesting is how interior so much of the film feels, even while you're exterior. So maybe if there's something else to add about that, I'd be interested.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I will just say that Agnes is the mother, the main character. Her internal journey was
Mm,
what I was most interested in, and but not like explicitly saying it, right? So finding ways of bringing out the kind of tension of motherhood, the challenges of motherhood that are not so easy to talk to give words to, right?
mm,
And I thought that definitely this kind of beautiful but possibly threatening landscape, at least in some parts, like that's how it's kind of depicted, was a great metaphor, or a great kind of extension of her own process. Yeah.
great. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that just leads me to a couple thoughts about some of the other films. I mean, to me, the role of the land and the landscape plays really heavily on Wandervogel, Mina. I mean, and you can probably speak, if you could speak about, you talked earlier about the isolation and the need for making relationships, which in the desert can almost feel like you have to sort of travel across some great distance to reach. So I'd just be interested if you could talk about the role of landscape in your film as well.
Sure. So the film takes place in West Texas, sort of on the border with Mexico in the Big Bend area. and it's part of the Chihuahuan Desert. And it's when I first visited there, I was just kind of blown away by the sort of alien nature of these wide expanses, but then you also have these beautiful mountains that just turn pink and purple and orange and red at sunset. And so it's just a really stunning, really very different landscape than in Vermont. There are no trees, except for in the kind of peaks of Big Bend National Park, you do get some trees, but for the most part, it's desert, it's high desert. So it's just really a beautiful place to photograph. And I felt just really drawn to celluloid and trying to capture it on 16 millimeter. So in the film, you kind of have these chapter markers of 16 millimeter film of the landscape. And for me, it was a way, so the character who had died, he had this really romanticized, sort of idealized vision of the desert. Mm-hmm. And photographing it in this medium that's sort of, you know, in its way dying, but still, you know, irreplaceable and so gorgeous. And the way it renders colors is so spectacular and unique, felt like the best way to represent his vision of the desert, which is kind of romantic and beautiful, idyllic place. At the same time, like Natasha was saying, it has this forbidding element to it. I think landscape can also be, nature can be terrifying and can be really overwhelming in its power. And so I think playing with that a bit in soundscape and bringing in sort of elements like wind and just the feeling of nature being able to overpower us is an important aspect of my interaction with these places.
Great. Well, that leads me perfectly into asking Quinn about her. Quinn is also works primarily with 16 millimeter film, and I think it would be great to hear her talk about her relationship to analog film and how that might, I mean, nature and community are also key to your work, Quinn. So maybe you could talk about that in relation to your film, which I think brings out a different overwhelming sensation of nature than perhaps Mina's film or Natasha's film. So maybe you could talk about that too.
Sure. I think for me, specifically with Nature's Optical Toy and the way that I used celluloid for the film, I mean, I think in general, I like using celluloid and physical film because it feels very intimate and because it feels very intentional. I mean, not that I can be intentional with my digital camera as well, but because I have X number of feet and processing it takes, you know, this amount of time, X number of time, it feels like I have to really savor and think about every single frame, especially if I'm doing animation. And for Nature's Optical Toy, for me, I mean, it's heavily inspired, and I feel like most people who watch it and know who Stan Brakhage is, it's heavily inspired by Mothlight. And for me, watching that film for the first time was when I was like, whoa, film can allow you to see things and from a completely different perspective. And I hadn't really imagined it from the perspective of just light shining through transparent nature and objects. And I was really fascinated by that. And I'm very connected to nature, having grown up in Vermont, and it feeling like a thing that grounds me, even if I'm not having a lot of human interaction. It can be my community as well, sitting by the river and listening to peepers, or being in my garden and knowing my plants, and being able to sort of take pieces of that and tape it directly to celluloid, for me felt like the most intimate way for me to capture nature at that time. And yeah, I mean, I like the way it looks. I like the way my mind works when I'm doing it. Feels very meditative, just like walking through it. So I feel like those two things really connected in a way, and is the reason why I used it for that film in particular. Yeah.
Yeah. And could you talk a bit about, it doesn't necessarily connect to this film, but I know from your other films that you have a particular view of community in film too. So, and that might connect to some of the other filmmakers we have here in their films. So,
Yeah, community is really important to me. My thesis in particular at Hampshire was I'll back up a little bit. I love experimental filmmaking. And I've struggled a lot with questioning its accessibility, especially in my time at Hampshire. And like, okay, I've been at this school and I've been watching these things and I understand how to read them, or maybe I don't, but I like enjoy figuring out how to read them. And that's not always easy for everybody. And especially because it's not a language that a lot of people learn. And I struggled with that. And I was like, well, it's important to me that people watch this and feel something from it. So why am I choosing this form of communicating if it's not accessible, and how do I make it accessible? And because I think there's a lot of power in people watching experimental film. And I ended up going on a tour across the United States for my thesis, where I played music, but I primarily was teaching cameraless film workshops. And so there was like over 200 people that drew directly onto celluloid, onto 16 millimeter clear leader. They taped things to it. They put nail polish on it. They drew on it, and they expressed themselves and put themselves down on this physical piece of film. And for me, I was on tour and I was taking these images on Super 8 and teaching these workshops, and I was having my memories and my own reflections. But for me, they felt very connected to the interactions that I was having at these workshops, because I feel like every human interaction, whether that be from a big community or just a small community, which can be a conversation, impacts the way that I'm starting to view life later on, or in the next moment, or in 5 years. And so for me, that was really important. And that film couldn't have been made without those 200 people, regardless of if they had drawn on film or not, just because they inspired me or taught me something, or made me question things. And so I enjoy working in community and filmmaking for that reason. I enjoy it because I think being able to offer something or learn something that's different from what you might normally do is important, and you need a community to do that. And I also think no film, even if you are isolated and making it yourself, because some of my other films are that, like I'm the only person taping things to my Nature's Optical Toy, but the film itself is still created because of the community that I'm around. So I'm influenced by people all the time. I'm listening to things, I'm going on walks with people, I'm having dinner, whatever, throughout my life. And I couldn't make any of the things that I make without that. I don't think any of us could, whether or not we're conscious of it or not. Yeah. So.
Well, that's great. That also leads me into, I think, I kind of came up with this idea of three main pillars, which are or for me at least, community, the landscape, and then a kind of idea of work. And for me, the idea of work is like, goes in two directions, because I think, and you've all sort of touched on it, because I think there's certain times, like Natasha said, when you're trying to make a certain kind of specific scripted film, that you really need to rely on a large community, or semi-large, depending. And then, as Mina said, working in an ideal situation at times for her has been completely alone, and same thing with Quinn. But I guess I'm interested in that. And so it leads me in my head back to something I was talking with Susan about at 7:50, right before we started, which is one of the things I really love about her Man of the Land film is being able to watch, and this is something that she touched upon, being able to watch, someone fix a baler and then use it to bale hay, which I think is such a beautiful thing and such a miraculous thing to watch. This dried grass turn into a nice bale, or sharpen a chainsaw blade, or do any number of things. So, and I think that'll lead into some other questions about practice and work. So I'm curious, Susan, if you could talk a bit again about, I guess, what it was like to put yourself in relation to Joe's work, and also and talk about or Peter Schumann baking bread, or I mean that relation of watching someone do something that it's sort of a teaching thing, a learning thing, but also, so maybe you can speak about that.
Well, it's just a lot of it just visually mesmerizing. You get hypnotized by the repetition, and you get drawn in, and you see the beauty of it, and it gives you something. It's some kind of gift.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know what else.
No, that's perfect. I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
And I think, and you are also someone, I mean, you have your own practice, right, of picking up the camera and filming whoever. I mean, I'm sometimes interested in that relationship of like the person you're filming is doing something that you might not know how to do. But at the same time, you filming them might be, I mean, you're sort of giving back something by filming them. Do you
I guess
agree?
it gives them a record.
Right.
Um,
And it sounds like Joe Picard was interested in that.
yeah, and it's not just a record. It's also, it gives them an audience, and I
Right.
think they like that.
Yeah.
These are people who do a lot of stuff by themselves.
Right.
Peter baking bread, and Joe doing the work that he does in the woods.
Yep.
They want somebody to admire them, and
Sure.
I admire them.
Yeah.
So
I do.
works for them.
Why? Yeah. And now it's out in the world. So
Yeah.
So I don't know if, I mean, I sort of connect that again, this idea of like working versus not. Rich, your films are, I mean, especially this film that's in the festival, Brief Glimpses, is very much, I mean, it's sort of a distillation of all your moments of life where you weren't working. I mean, you were maybe relaxing or with friends or riding a motorcycle or on the beach or just sitting in the backyard or with your cat. But at the same time, you're accumulating work and you're working, you're filming, you're eventually editing it all together, which is thousands of frames of film, and you're thinking about it. And so maybe you could talk about, and at the same time, you're also working alone doing that. But eventually you like have us over for dinner to watch it the first time you show it to someone, or, and you're also having dinner with people in the film. So this both being alone and being together. So if you could talk about that in specific with working on this film. Oh, I think you're muted, Rich.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, it is a solitary, for the most part, unless you're working on a big production where you have the crew and so forth. But most of my filmmaking is done in a solitary fashion, but sometimes in the company of other people. And because there are other people in that film besides myself.
Right.
But, you mentioned something about, oh yeah, we'll make the film and then invite you over to screen it. I mean, that just goes back to the very beginning again. And this idea of community is that back when I first started making films, there were other people who lived in the house or were other friends who passed through who also would make films or were interested in making films. And maybe they didn't have a camera, so I'd be the cameraman, but execute their vision. But one of the goals was always to, when we had some new films to show, we would have a party And we would do, screen these things at these gatherings, and they would happen periodically. And that was lost to me for a while, mainly because I was just, in the midst of a career in healthcare, and I can't do any filming there. In the early days, actually, you could, and I do have one film that I made in a hospital about an old man that I grew very fond of, and his interaction with some of my nursing colleagues, which I called Harry Among the Angels of Mercy. But I digress. At any rate, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I can't live without socializing. So people are always going to show up in my films.
Right. Well, but can you live without filming, or?
Can I live without filming? No.
Right.
No, I can't. I mean, there are periods, because I have this whole other practice in collage and assemblage where I may be doing a lot of work there, and the filmmaking goes off to the side for a while. But I always come back to filmmaking too, because there's always something that'll inspire you. Plus, a lot of the footage in the film that's in the festival was just sort of offhanded stuff, because I always, especially if I'm traveling anywhere or going outside, I'll always have a camera with me, and maybe, only 30% of the time I would shoot a frame, but if I don't have the camera, I lose the opportunity
Right.
of finding something when I'm outside in the world somewhere. And if I don't have the camera, then I mourn the loss of that particular image, because I suddenly see it. I don't have the camera.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the constant question. I mean, I think for everyone, right? It's like, are you making a film, or are you just, the difference between making a film and just living?
Sometimes it's both of those things, not
Right.
simultaneously. That's that film is I'm just shooting film,
Right.
and then I assemble it after a period of time.
Yeah.
I may have been working on something more planned at the same time that
Right.
footage that is in that film, but I also just like being able to just shoot off a few frames here or there if I see something that really captures my attention, or I find very beautiful or ugly or whatever it may be. And then it'll end up in part 2 of Brief Glimpses on the Way to Joy.
Right. All right. Well, I think I don't want to end, but I do want to. We've had so many amazing impressions on filmmaking, on so many different kinds of filmmaking. And I don't know if there's any thoughts or questions or concluding. I see a hand from Susan. Why don't you go ahead, Susan?
My question is about experimental film. A lot of times filmmakers describe themselves as storytellers. And from what I see of experimental film, there's a lot of anti-narrative sentiment. So how would you address that? What do you, like Quinn and Rich, I guess these are,
Do you want to try?
this is your bailiwick.
Why don't you try, Quinn?
I mean, I don't know if I have an answer, but I see both happening in experimental filmmaking. I mean, I think there are some that are like very specifically non-narrative and maybe intend to be, but also sometimes I'm watching experimental films and I am seeing a narrative, whether they're supposed to be that way or not. I mean, for Stan Brockage, Mothlight, for me, I'm like thinking about maybe it's not a linear story, but there's still this moth being taped to 16 millimeter and it's projected through a light, and it's a dead moth, and moths are often attracted to light and they're, end up dying, having been attached to that. And so I don't know, I sometimes, for me, I read into those films, or I find my own narrative, often not linear, but then there's also experimental filmmakers who do make linear stories, but they're still experimental. I mean, Guy Madden would be a good example of that, whose latest film is also in the festival. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's
So-
an answer or just my perspective on it.
If I could put something towards you, Susan, I mean, there's also a narrative in bailing haying a field, right? Is there, but it also isn't necessarily, or maybe it is a story, I'm not sure, but there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to that too.
I think it's a great question, though. I like thinking about those things. I think it's really great.
Yeah, I would just say, Susan, you said, you get the sense that experimental film is anti-narrative. I wouldn't say it's anti-narrative. It may be non-narrative sometimes, or it may be a disjointed or surreal narrative at times. I've made a few films like that too. But I think if you look at narrative like you would look at, say, a novel, I think a crude analogy might be that some experimental films, rather than aspire to be a visual version of a novel with a narrative, that I think a lot of experimental film, and I hope that when I find something that I've done that I really like, it's because I found a poetry in it. So I think that's really maybe where that may be leaning. Some people may lean more toward that in experimental film, to want to do something more poetic than just tell a story or a narrative. But there are plenty of experimental filmmakers who do make narrative films, but it may be in some way disjointed or surreal, like I said. But we're not anti-narrative.
This is a great, I mean, I wish I had come up with this question earlier, because it's a great topic too, because I think I think A Mother, Natasha, your film is a narrative film, but I think we could have a lot of arguments or agreements maybe also about what narrative means in that context. And I think the same for Vondervogel. So in terms of storytelling, and I mean, narrative can sometimes mean like a flow of a story, or so. Natasha, maybe starting with you to wrap this up, talking about filmmaking and narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. When I hear people talk about experimental filmmaking and working on 16 millimeter film, I get so jealous and I'm so inspired, and I don't trust myself enough to do full experimental films. I find it so incredible, but it's scary too. It's such a big risk, but I definitely am inspired. I mean, I'm thinking of Mothlight, and it's such a beautiful film, and I love this idea that there is a narrative kind of embedded in there, although it's not necessarily kind of obvious. And I definitely lean on these kind of even if they're not experimental, but maybe non-traditionally Hollywood, non-Western narrative structures, other ways of telling stories that I think are great and can make us focus on other things, right? And yeah, so definitely, it's funny, Everest, as you were asking that, I was just thinking about the ways that A Mother was kind of dabbling in an experimental filmmaking in
You should jump in. You should jump right in now.
I might be trying my hand at it,
Great.
letting go a little bit.
Exciting. Actually, okay, so Mina, I don't know if you have any thoughts about storytelling in terms of, go for it.
Sure, yeah, and I know we're running out of time, and I saw Samantha had her hand up, so I just wanted to also make sure if there was a question to give her the floor, but I can also answer first, and then we can end with her.
You go ahead first, Mina. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I just really appreciate the conversation and the question from Susan. I think there's a bit of like pride when I hear anti-narrative, because there's a frustration in watching films that you don't get, and that you just kind of feel like there's a crime being done against you because you don't understand it. But they are also very personal, and everybody reacts differently to different films. So from Quinn and Richard, I really appreciated your responses. And I think for myself, definitely the sort of poetry response resonated, and trying to think of a film as a poem is really something to aspire to. And I think for Wandervogel, and for a lot of the films that I work on that maybe have less sort of narrative, or less dialogue, less people talking, and maybe is more of a visual poem, I think about it not in terms of narrative, but in terms of logic. Just as an editor, what's my organizing logic? How am I arranging these images together in a way that makes sense to me, in a flow and a sort of language that I can start to understand as the editor or writer of the images. So yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a
And it
lot.
feels very poetic. I mean, that is sort of the, I mean, I like what you said, right? You said something, you just said something about images and writing or something like that. And that feels very, I mean, poetry is a lot about sort of placing things like that.
Yeah. And what Richard said about a disjointed logic, I like that as well. It's not that it's not there, but it's like dream logic. It might relate in a way that only makes sense to you later when you close your eyes to go to sleep or something.
Absolutely. Samantha?
Well, I had a thought a while ago that I lost track of, but and I want to say that I haven't had a chance to see Wandervogel yet, and I'm really excited to. But I just wanted to really just shout out appreciation with the chance to speak directly to Natasha and Susan, because each of your films just impacted me so much. I really appreciated, Natasha, that, and it's interesting where this conversation went about the zone where the audience has to work to make meaning in the narrative. And I felt like you did that really artfully. Like you orient us to what's going on, but then there's such a zone where I just emotionally, as a mother, and a mother who also had to, for medical reasons, terminate a pregnancy, before my first child was born. Just the inner territory that you explored, I just haven't had a chance to see that, and it just like was so deeply personal. And the only film I've seen that dealt with that was the only experimental film that I ever made when I was a UCLA student, at which I made using ultrasound footage from the doctor's appointment when I was told that my baby was not going to make it. So I had tried to work with some of that emotional territory, but I also liked the clarity of your character, that she was clear about her choice. That was really powerful to me also, at the same time that it was so nuanced about all the layers that were happening. And I wanted to say to Susan, your film, my father kind of returned to the land in the 80s and tried to start a family farm, which lasted about 10 years. And I was in balers watching him try to figure out how to fix them. And just, there were farmers in central Maine with speech that felt like such a national treasure that's disappearing. And the oral history aspect of your film and the language that you've preserved is just, extraordinary. And there's a website called Folk Streams. If you don't know it, it's a treasure. He basically, I can give you the link. And I think he's turned his collection over to the Smithsonian now, but I have made a short film with a man in Mississippi who's now deceased, but I so appreciate your capturing, Joe. Thanks.
Thank you, Samantha.
Are there any other thoughts or comments or questions from anyone who was listening? I'm not sure what the time sort of scenario is. It's past 9 now, so I think it's time to close down, but I sort of don't want to, but
Can I make a pitch that we have the Zoom after hours for the festival, which is in the email that went out today, and Everest, I don't know, maybe you could share with the filmmakers if they didn't get it. But it's just an unstructured place for anybody who's wants to keep talking.
let me see if I can.
Everest, I can send it because I'm hosting it, so I have the link. Just give me
Excellent.
yeah.
Great. I sort of wanted to have one last maybe structured comment while we're here, or question, because one thing I put, and I don't know how people feel about getting into this, but I'm sort of curious about, well, one thing I wanted to talk about that we didn't quite get to, but we also definitely did, was the beginnings and ends of things, of like a film or a project or a period of life or something like that. I think everyone sort of talked about beginnings. I am sort of, if anyone has a thought about ends, either ends of films, I think that's interesting for actually everyone here, talk about the end of their actual film, either the end or the end of the making it, or when you knew you reached the end or something like that. And then the last thing is, I'm sort of curious, and I got piqued again because Natasha talked about the possibilities about what is coming. We're coming out of the virus, we're coming into summertime, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. We're feeling great, I guess. I hope, and I am right now. So maybe just chat about that too. So I don't know if anyone wants to start on ends and new beginnings. I think someone to point, I mean, Rich, I'm kind of curious how you knew that you were done making Brief Glimpses, or if you, I mean, you're still not done because you said you're making part 2, but.
Yeah. I'm always shooting some footage, and as I said before, sometimes it's just a few frames, of pixelation or something. But eventually, when I have enough footage, I'll put out a part 2 if those elements don't end up in another film. But that film just came about because I had all this footage that I really liked, but I didn't have a place for it,
Right.
And so I thought, well, let me just start putting these images together and let them bump up against each other and see what happens. As far as finding the end of that, I had enough footage that I knew it was long enough, and I had found the musical accompaniment that really worked for the film to me. The end was almost a cliche, but it worked as an ending to it, in that it was just some black and white footage that I had shot of some bare trees, but with the sun going down behind the trees, and using, an interval meter. It had a nice descent and then went into just gray in these dark trees. It seemed like, okay, there's the end of this film,
Very natural.
This film is over, so it's not always that way, but that's how it happened with that particular film. It just seemed like it was the perfect ending for it.
Yeah. And the next step is, you're, like you said, cutting together, but you're cutting together footage also from the last decade or so of.
Yeah. There's still some footage that was shot, on rolls that wasn't used in a film. Like I've been working on this stop motion animation film now for almost 2 years, on and off. And I will shoot some of that, single frame, laborious process. And, but then I take the camera out and shoot some film. So eventually,
Little bits.
Little by little, enough accrues that I see if I have something that is appealing, But then there's these things that I have definite plans about, and including this animation, which actually has a narrative thread, surreal thread, but a narrative thread to it. Has a definite beginning and an end.
Yeah. Susan, your film, I find to end in an interesting way, which is back with Joe plowing, which is right where it starts. I think right when it starts, you see him plow past, and then at the end, when you put the title up again, he's back to plowing, and it's just kind of seasons have returned. So I'm curious if you do talk about that ending, the passing of the seasons, and also what you're up to. I know that you've shot that film a long time ago, so I'm curious if what's the next thing, if there is. I think you're muted. I think you're still muted. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost the visual, but
Oh.
yeah, I guess, you know, ending with the beginning is looping it around is a way to avoid having to decide on the ending. But it also just, you know, pretty much showed the cycle of the seasons, which is sort of one of my fascinations. In terms of what I'm doing now, I'm working for Orca Media, which is the Montpelier office of public access television, the network across the state. And I'm mostly editing. We get a lot of YouTube videos from the state legislature because that's our local happening thing, and we have to edit them to put them back on the Orca YouTube channel. So that's mainly what I'm doing. I don't have a new film project at the moment, but maybe I'll be working with Ethan Hubbard, who's a still photographer who does a lot of books of mostly portraits of people from all over the world, and he's interested in rural characters. And so in his latest book, he's interested in turning that into a film. We'll see if that happens.
Great.
So that's about it.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Quinn, I don't know if it makes sense to ask how you've learned how your film ends or not. It's so short, but I know that it's sort of based on, or this has this idea of going for a walk, and I suppose a walk always ends somewhere, so no matter how short. So I'm curious if you could talk about ending Nature's Optical Toy, and then again what you're thinking about doing the coming year or months, or as an
yeah, I don't know why I ended it the way I did. It just felt right. I also, you know, there's a musical component to it that's made up of nature sounds, and sometimes I don't always edit to sound, but in this case I had so much of like this 16mm film and figuring out ways that it was relating to the noise that was being shown. So like that was part of what the time was, because that's just sort of what I was able to create with my friend Bella, who helped me with sound. And it also just felt right. And I think sometimes that's all it is for me. It's not always like a clear reason why. It just feels like the right thing. In terms of what I'm working on or not working on and trying to work on, my dad has a huge like fascination, and has since he's been a collector since he was like a little kid. He was interested in magnets and rocks and fluorescent rocks, and like old kindergarten toys and the color from these kindergarten toys. And the house is just full of this stuff, just over the years of my dad's life. And I guess 2 summers ago, I started shooting animation of those on 16 millimeter. And I'm not really sure where that's going. I just keep like picking up my camera and like I'll have a roll of film and I'll shoot these different figures in different ways. But I'd like to finish that at some point, and I'll probably be working on that this summer. I also actually currently have a roll of film in my Bolex, because I was shooting I'm Jewish, and I've always been fascinated with Christmas lights and the light of the menorah, and just like in these dark times thinking about light, or in dark times thinking about light. And I started shooting like long exposure frames on my Bolex of lights around in the winter and the menorah, and that's not processed yet. And there's still like a tiny bit left in the camera that I need to figure out what I'm doing with. It's not stays really light now until like 8:30, so I have to find a new time to do that. And yeah, just I am making films with kids because I teach at an after school program, but I'm feeling like very ready to finish something again soon. I feel like I'm the kind of person that picks up a lot of, I'm interested in a lot of different things, and so I start a lot of different things. And I'm good at finishing stuff. It's just sometimes I have too many things that I want to make, and too many things that I want to collaborate on. And sometimes that's other people's films too. So here's to hoping that something comes out of it soon.
Great, thank you. And Mina, I think Wandervogel's a really, I can imagine that, the way that the film is put together, I can imagine it to be a very, the way it lands, I could see there being, I guess, alternate ways of ending that film. So I'm interested in how you arrived at the flow from the beginning and then landing where the film does at the end.
Yeah, I definitely reached the end of that process kicking and screaming and didn't want to finish the film. And I just felt like I had to finish something, mostly because I was coming to the end of my MFA thesis. And so a film came out of it and it was done. But I think it feels, at least the response that I got and what it felt like to me, is that it's really like the first part of a longer film, because it raises so many questions and it doesn't have time to really answer as many as it raises. And so it's very connected to what I'm doing right now. So I'm actually in the process of developing this film into a feature film.
Oh, wow.
And so for about a year now, we've been raising funds, and we're hoping to be able to shoot sort of early next year, and then finish completion of my first feature, which will be something of the content of the short film, but then a lot of new material, which we'll shoot also on film down in Texas. And it's sort of a reimagination of the life Dan was living shortly before he died, and his relationship with a young man that was living with him. So it's part narrative, part documentary, and that's what I'm working on right now.
Well, that's fascinating. I think we'd all love to see if there's any way to hear more about the project going into the future. If you could share that with us, we'd love that.
Yeah, I could share. Actually tomorrow we're doing a pitch on a website, or a documentary film festival that's going on right now as well, called Docs Barcelona. But I think the pitch is public, and so we'll be showing a short trailer and trying to just kind of get attention and investment from sort of a broad documentary community in Europe and in the US, and in South America. So that's one way to find out about it, but I'm happy to also, share other links and trailers as they become available. But yeah.
Thank you for filling us in on that. That's great.
Thanks.
That's perfect too, because we had wanted to show this film last year, and we know that it's even then was a year or two since you had made it, but that's really exciting to learn that. So hopefully someday WRIF will be able to show the feature version.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Great. And Natasha, when it comes to ending a film, what was the process like of, creating, so was your ending scripted? Was it something you found? What is that process like in a film, in your film?
Yeah, this is, I just want to say this is such a funny question, because I was just listening to a podcast yesterday, a film podcast, and the hosts were talking about how you get to the end of your movie and you just know, right? You just feel it. And I was thinking, what are they talking about? What do they mean you just know? You don't just know. And I was like ranting. I was so just almost disturbed that they like had this narrative going on. But that being said, I did have the ending in mind for a mother. I knew I wanted her to take the abortion pills at the end. Absolutely. It was important for me I wanted to see that in the film. Even though she goes through like she has different feelings about it, right? But ultimately she's set on going through with it. That being said, though, to get to like a point where I was like, okay, I'm ready to shoot, and it's time to go. It was really it's deadlines. Deadlines are the only thing that are going to push me forward, because I will just keep writing, rewriting, doubting, saying, what if it could be this way, it could be that way, could it not, and just funding deadlines, screenwriting, whatever deadlines are the things that kind of push me forward. But yeah, everything was it was written in the script exactly as you see it.
Right.
It was there. Yeah.
I'm curious just about the end. Then you say exactly as you see it, and how about exactly as you hear it? Because there's an interesting, the end with sound is also, I think at the end, right at the end, you can hear, she can hear her kids. Is that?
Yeah. Actually, that's a great question. That, well, that's a very good question. Actually, I don't know. Sound was a really fun and interesting process. I was collaborating with Chilean, part of post-production was actually done in Chile. It was in Santiago, Chile, because my husband is from Chile. He was the executive producer of the film and he's a filmmaker also, and has a lot of contacts in Santiago. And so there were a lot of ideas coming in post-production from the sound part of things that definitely were not written. It's so background
Right.
sounds, music, absolutely. Was a
really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really fun process of, speaking of community and collaboration, that definitely happened later. Yeah.
Interesting. And is it possible, you mentioned something in the future, but if you could talk about your plans in terms of filmmaking, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm shooting a short this summer. I'm determined to do so. It'll be not as involved as a mother in terms of being able to bring people and all of that stuff. It'll be much more. I will be in it. There'll be much more, like, it'll be. This is the
confined, small.
Yeah, confined. But it will be. Sorry.
Close knit.
Close knit, yes, but very much like thematically related to a mother. And at the same time, I've been working on other kind of larger projects.
Yeah, I did. Oh, sorry, I didn't. I noticed on your website an interesting feature film that you've been working on. Is that? I'm sorry to cut in on you. Is that what you were gonna?
Yeah. I mean, this is many years in the making. It's a documentary about my family's my family is from Tanzania in East Africa, in this northwestern part of Tanzania. So the documentary is kind of focusing on that area and specifically looking at bananas in the area. There's a crisis of bananas right now around the world, and so it kind of it's ongoing. But yeah, that's another project in the works.
Yeah, well, definitely would be excited to hear about that as it progresses as well.
Thanks.
Great. All right. Well, I don't know what else. I'm not sure if there's any other thoughts. Maybe anyone has a last comment. I think we're holding up the after hours chat, but we also might be the after hours chat. I'm not sure. So I guess we can say thank you and goodbyes. I thank all of the filmmakers for joining in and offering so much tonight. I thought we really maybe didn't figure out what it means to be a Vermont filmmaker, but we figured out 5 different ways it means to be a Vermont filmmaker at least. So that was really cool. All right.
I just want to say I really enjoyed meeting all of you who I don't know and talking with you. It was very nice. Thank you, Everest.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you
Great.
very much.
Okay.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Everest.